There is a Sumerian text held today across several major museum collections that describes in considerable narrative detail what its characters experience after death. According to some researchers who have studied alternative readings of this material, the description is unusually specific compared to other ancient afterlife narratives, specific enough that a minority of independent researchers have proposed reading it not as mythology, but as something closer to a structured account. The text in question is real, and it is genuinely ancient. It is known to mainstream Assyriology as the Descent of Inanna, and it is one of the oldest substantially complete narrative compositions in the surviving written record, predating the Homeric epics by well over 1,000 years. This much is established and not in dispute. What is in dispute, entirely outside mainstream scholarly consensus, is how the text should be interpreted. The mainstream academic reading, held by the overwhelming majority of Assyriologists and historians of religion, treats the descent of Inanna as a mythological narrative, a story using a goddess figure's symbolic journey to explore themes of loss, transformation, and the relationship between the upper and lower worlds in Sumerian cosmology. This is the scholarly consensus, and it sits within a well-documented tradition of similar journey and transformation narratives across many ancient cultures. A separate minority body of alternative research, work that exists almost entirely outside peer-reviewed academic channels, has proposed reading the same text in a much more literal way, as a description of an actual mechanism governing human consciousness after death. This documentary explores that alternative reading, the reasoning behind it, and where it diverges sharply from what mainstream scholarship actually supports. Nothing that follows should be understood as confirming that this alternative reading is correct. Before we go further, if this kind of historical and archaeological exploration is what you're here for, subscribe now. Every week this channel examines the texts, tablets, and interpretive debates that sit at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. To understand the alternative reading, it helps to first understand the genuine Sumerian conceptual framework around the human being, a framework that is real, documented, and worth taking seriously on its own terms, separate from any claims about its literal accuracy. Sumerian texts do describe the human being as a composite entity, made up of multiple components rather than a single unified soul, in the way later Western religious traditions typically frame it. The physical body, referred to in various texts, was understood as formed from clay, a genuine and recurring motif across Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian creation literature. Separately, Sumerian and Akkadian texts reference a surviving aspect of the person after death, commonly rendered in translation as a ghost, shade, or spirit, a concept broadly comparable to afterlife concepts found across many unrelated ancient cultures. Sumerian religious vocabulary also includes the term mi, a genuinely difficult word to translate, referring to something like the fundamental attributes, functions, or governing principles associated with civilization, divine authority, and cosmic order. Mainstream Assyriology treats the mi as an abstract theological and administrative concept, closer to the foundational institutions and powers that structure the world, than to anything resembling a technical or mechanical system. Some alternative researchers have proposed reading the mi in a more literal, almost technological sense. That reading is not supported by mainstream translation work, and it is worth being upfront that it represents a significant departure from how working Assyriologists actually render the term. With that vocabulary established, here is how the descent of Inanna itself is structured, and how the two competing readings diverge from there. In the narrative, the goddess Inanna travels to the underworld, referred to in Sumerian as Kur, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. To pass through, she must travel through 7 gates, and at each gate, she is required to remove an article of clothing or a symbol of her status and power. By the final gate, she has been stripped of everything, and she is judged and struck down within the underworld itself before later being restored to the world above through the intervention of other figures in the pantheon. The mainstream scholarly reading treats the 7 gates as a literary device representing the systematic stripping of status, identity, and power, a common motif in transformation narratives across world literature, frequently read as connected to themes of seasonal death and renewal, given Inanna's broader associations with fertility and the agricultural cycle. This reading is well supported by comparative work across Mesopotamian religious literature and is the position taught in mainstream university courses on the subject. The alternative reading, advanced by a small number of researchers working outside mainstream Assyriology, proposes something different: that the 7 gates describe stages of an actual post-death process in which something resembling memory, identity, or awareness is genuinely removed at each stage, not symbolically, but as a literal description of what these researchers argue is a designed mechanism. It is important to state plainly, there is no scholarly support for this literal reading within mainstream Mesopotamian studies. It rests on treating a documented mythological narrative as a technical manual, a move that the broader field of comparative religion and ancient Near Eastern studies has not found persuasive, in large part because the narrative shares clear structural and thematic features with other journey and transformation myths from unrelated cultures and time periods, a pattern more consistent with shared mythological structure than with a literal, shared technical description. Some proponents of the alternative reading point to apparent similarities between the Sumerian text and other ancient or traditional frameworks describing death and rebirth, including concepts found in Tibetan Buddhist literature describing stages of consciousness after death, in ancient Egyptian funerary texts describing judgment and weighing of the heart, in Vedic concepts of a cycle of rebirth, and in Gnostic texts, a body of early Christian-era writings rediscovered in the Nag Hammadi find of 1945, which describe the material world as governed by intermediary beings the texts call archons. It's worth being clear and careful here because this is exactly the kind of comparison that can sound more significant than it actually is. Mainstream scholars of comparative religion have extensively documented that many unrelated cultures, across very different time periods and with no plausible direct contact, independently developed afterlife narratives involving stages, trials, judgment, or transformation. This is generally explained within mainstream scholarship as reflecting shared and recurring human responses to mortality, rather than as evidence of a single, shared literal system inherited or transmitted from a common ancient source. The existence of structurally similar afterlife narratives across cultures is well documented. The claim that they describe one single literal mechanism is a minority interpretive position, not a finding accepted by scholars of comparative religion or Assyriology. This documentary draws on these comparisons only to show how the alternative interpretation has been constructed by its proponents, not because the comparison itself constitutes evidence that any of these traditions describe a real, shared system. The alternative reading explored by some independent researchers connects this material to a separate and equally contested body of claims regarding the Anunnaki, figures who do appear extensively and genuinely across real Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian texts. What is not in dispute, the Anunnaki are referenced across thousands of authentic cuneiform texts and Sumerian creation narratives, including the Atrahasis epic, a genuine and well-studied ancient text, do describe the creation of humanity in connection with these figures, including a narrative in which laboring, lower-ranking divine figures are described as exhausted by their work, prompting the creation of humans to take over that labor. This narrative is real, it is well documented within mainstream Assyriology, and it is generally read by scholars as a creation myth addressing questions about why humans exist and why human life involves hardship and labor, a theme found in numerous unrelated ancient creation traditions. What is not supported by mainstream scholarship is the claim, advanced by ancient astronaut researchers and other alternative historians, that this narrative describes literal genetic engineering, performed by physically present extraterrestrial or otherwise advanced beings. This remains, within the field of ancient Near Eastern studies and archaeology broadly, an unsupported fringe position. It is mentioned here only because it forms part of the interpretive framework some researchers use to connect the Inanna narrative to claims about an afterlife system, and viewers should understand that this entire chain of reasoning rests on an initial interpretive leap that mainstream scholarship does not accept. Some proponents of this framework go further still, proposing that if the creation of humanity was, in their reading, a deliberate engineering project, then a designed afterlife process, one that conveniently erases memory and returns a renewed labor force to the world, would serve a similar functional purpose. This is presented by its proponents as an internally consistent extension of their framework. It should be understood clearly as speculation, built on top of an already unverified premise, several interpretive steps removed from anything that exists in the actual surviving text. It's worth pausing here to be precise about language, because this is where popular retellings of this material often drift furthest from the primary sources. The phrase, sometimes translated as the land of no return, which does appear across genuine Sumerian underworld literature, is read by mainstream scholars in a straightforward sense. It refers to the underworld as a place the dead do not journey back from to rejoin the living. This is a documented, conventional, poetic and religious framing found in numerous ancient cultures' underworld concepts, and mainstream Assyriologists do not read it as a coded technical reference to memory loss or psychological erasure. The alternative, more elaborate reading, that no return refers specifically to memory and identity rather than physical presence, is an interpretation proposed by researchers working outside the field, not a translation supported by Sumerian linguistic evidence. This distinction matters because the more dramatic version of this claim depends entirely on that reinterpretation holding up, and it is not a reading that specialists in the Sumerian language have endorsed. Some alternative researchers further propose that various spiritual and esoteric traditions, including certain Tibetan Buddhist teachings on the dying process, Gnostic teachings on direct spiritual insight, and elements of Egyptian funerary practice, represent surviving fragments of instructions for navigating or escaping this proposed system, traceable back to an original source in ancient Sumer. This is worth addressing directly and clearly. Tibetan Buddhist teachings on the dying process, Gnostic concepts of spiritual insight, and Egyptian funerary practices are each independently well-documented religious and philosophical traditions with their own distinct historical development, textual lineages, and cultural contexts, extensively studied by specialists in their respective fields. Mainstream historians of religion do not trace these traditions to a single common Sumerian origin point. The claim that they represent a hidden, transmitted body of knowledge originating in ancient Mesopotamia is not supported by the textual or historical record as understood by specialists in any of these individual traditions. It is a synthesis proposed by alternative researchers working across multiple fields, rather than a conclusion drawn from within any one of them. It is worth pausing here to separate clearly what is genuinely established from what remains claimed and contested. What can be independently verified? The Descent of Inanna is a real, ancient, and extensively studied Sumerian literary text, among the oldest substantial narratives in the surviving written record. The Atrahasis epic is real and does describe a creation narrative involving the Anunnaki and the alleviation of divine labor through the creation of humanity. The Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts are real and were genuinely discovered in 1945. Tibetan Buddhist teachings on the dying process and Egyptian funerary literature, including the text conventionally known as the Book of the Dead, are real, extensively documented religious traditions in their own right. What has not been independently verified or accepted by mainstream scholarship: the claim that any of these texts literally describe a designed mechanism for erasing memory and recycling human consciousness. The claim that the Anunnaki were physically present advanced beings who genetically engineered humanity. The claim that these separate religious and philosophical traditions share a single common origin in ancient Sumer, transmitted secretly across millennia. None of these claims appear in peer-reviewed Assyriological, religious studies, or archaeological literature in the form presented by their proponents. What remains genuinely open, within mainstream scholarship itself, how best to interpret the symbolic and theological meaning of the Descent of Inanna, how much continuity exists between different ancient Near Eastern afterlife concepts, and why structurally similar death and rebirth narratives appear independently across so many unrelated world cultures. These are legitimate, actively studied questions, but they are studied through comparative religion, linguistics, and archaeology, not through the literal framework explored by alternative researchers in this material. What is worth holding on to, regardless of the more speculative claims explored here, is a genuine and remarkable historical reality. The Sumerians, along with the Egyptians, the early Vedic tradition, and many other ancient cultures, grappled seriously and thoughtfully with questions about mortality, identity, and what, if anything, persists after death. The Descent of Inanna is a genuinely old, genuinely rich piece of human literature, regardless of whether it is read as myth or, as a minority of researchers propose, as something else entirely. Whether any of the more elaborate claims explored in this documentary reflect anything beyond an imaginative synthesis built across unrelated traditions is a question that would require evidence mainstream scholarship has not found, and that this documentary does not claim to provide. Until then, the question remains open, and open questions, examined honestly and without being mistaken for settled answers, are where understanding begins.